Welcome to the auditory journey of Healing the Shame That Binds You by John Bradshaw. This is not simply an adaptation, it is a profound descent into the architecture of the human soul tailored for those committed to daily intellectual and spiritual expansion. We will dissect the shadows of human psychology, exposing the toxic shame that masquerades as perfectionism, anger, and addiction. Let this philosophical exploration provide the high-contrast lighting needed to illuminate the deep, dark cinematic backgrounds of the mind. Chapter 1. The Dual Faces of Shame. The architecture of human suffering is deeply entangled with the ancient mystery of evil. For centuries, humanity has sought to explain the existence of malevolence by projecting it outward onto fallen angels and mythological adversaries, engaging in a polarized battle between absolute good and absolute darkness. Yet, the true landscape of destruction does not reside in the external world. It is an internal affliction, a permanent aspect of the human condition that we frequently deny out of an instinct for survival. When we refuse to acknowledge this shadow, we inadvertently multiply it, dispensing miseries under the illusion of righteousness. The structure of this darkness transcends individual malice. It is what can be described as the demonic, a natural human function that has somehow gathered the power to encompass and consume the entire personality. At the very epicenter of this psychological possession lies the affect of shame. When violated and distorted, this deeply intimate feeling metastasizes into an all-embracing identity, convincing an individual that they are inherently flawed, irreparably inferior, and fundamentally defective. This internalization is the root of an agonizing internal torment, birthing the defending scripts that fuel violence, cruelty, prejudice, and every conceivable form of destructive addiction. To understand the monstrous mutation of this emotion, we must first understand its pure, innate form. Shame, in its original state, is not a sickness. It is a vital, healthy human feeling that serves as the ultimate teacher of our boundaries. It is the psychological foundation of our humility, the emotional boundary line that grants us the profound permission to be human. Humans are not omnipotent deities. We are perfectly imperfect, finite beings who will inevitably falter and require the assistance of others. Healthy shame acts as a gentle internal warning light, signaling our essential limitations so that we do not exhaust our life force pursuing the illusion of infinite control. It grounds us. It reminds us that we are not the center of the universe, preserving our energy for reachable goals and genuine connections. This healthy boundary begins its development in the earliest stages of life, built upon the foundation of an interpersonal bridge of trust and mutual empathy between a child and a caregiver. As the child ventures out to explore the world, healthy shame first emerges as a natural shyness in the presence of the unknown, guarding the vulnerable inner core from sudden overexposure. Later, it evolves into the blush of embarrassment when we are caught off guard or make a mistake in our social maneuvering. The ability to blush is the physical manifestation of our limited humanity, a beautiful, involuntary surrender to the reality that we are not infallible. Furthermore, this healthy sense of inadequacy is the very wellspring of creativity and wonder. If we lived in a state of absolute certainty and limitless power, we would never seek new knowledge. Healthy shame keeps our minds open, driving us to learn, to connect with our community, and to seek out the intimacy we need to survive. Ultimately, the feeling of limitation expands into a profound sense of awe and reverence for the vast immensity of life, guiding us toward the sacred and serving as the absolute guardian of our spirituality. Tragically, this life-affirming emotion possesses a terrifying duality. Just as cholesterol exists in both life-sustaining and life-destroying forms, shame can curdle into a toxic sickness of the soul. When healthy shame is subjected to chronic trauma, abandonment, or the demands of a perfectionistic environment, it undergoes a lethal transformation. It ceases to be a passing emotional signal that monitors our behavior and instead freezes into a permanent state of being. The individual no longer feels they have made a mistake. They believe they are a mistake. This is the internalization process, a devastating rupture of the self by the self. The individual becomes an object of their own unyielding contempt, trapped in a tormenting cycle of internal scrutiny and self-alienation. To exist with toxic shame is to experience an agonizing, bleeding exposure on the inside, accompanied by a hollow, haunting sense of absence and isolation. The descent into this toxic state occurs progressively across the developmental stages of life. In infancy, a faulty or traumatic attachment can induce a primal being shame bind, where a child absorbs the unexpressed resentments and hidden secrets of their caregivers. The child intuitively carries the emotional weight of a parent who may secretly view them as a burden, resulting in an acute, isolating shyness. As the child enters toddlerhood and begins the psychological birth of separating from their caregivers, their newly emerging autonomy and willful exploration are often met with severe suppression. When the natural impulses to say no or test boundaries are crushed through punishment, the child's willpower becomes inextricably bound to shame. This purpose shame bind forces the individual into either total conformity or rebellious defiance, crippling their true selfhood and personal power. By the time the child reaches school age, this internalized defectiveness solidifies into neurotic guilt and immorality shame. The child either attempts to build inhuman ego defenses, becoming a perfectionistic achiever, or surrenders to the feeling of worthlessness, becoming a scapegoat. As the profound transformations of puberty arrive, the newly awakened sex drive merges with this deep-seated shame, creating an excruciating vulnerability. Identity confusion reigns, and the teenager desperately attempts to anchor their fractured self to a peer group, often resulting in compulsive behaviors, early addictions, and an intensified internal war. Moving into adulthood, the toxically shamed person finds genuine intimacy impossible. Bereft of a true identity, they navigate relationships through a defensive false self, creating enmeshed codependent bonds aimed at filling the gaping void within, rather than authentic connections based on vulnerability. Without intervention, this trajectory culminates in a stagnant later adulthood characterized by late-stage addictions, profound depression, and the tragic reality of never having lived one's own authentic life. Because this core agony is unbearable, the psyche instinctively constructs elaborate, impenetrable defenses. The authentic self retreats into absolute darkness, and a false self is manufactured to interface with the world. This false identity operates in absolute extremes, desperately attempting to be more than human or resigning itself to being less than human. The super-achieving perfectionist, driven by an insatiable need to prove their worth through external validation, is propelled by the exact same core of toxic shame as the individual drowning in stagnation and despair. Both are running from the excruciating conviction that their true self is hopelessly defective. This internalized self-loathing is the dark fuel feeding the engine of all compulsive and addictive behaviors. Whether the addiction is to a chemical substance, the acquisition of wealth, the pursuit of power, or the desperate enmeshment of codependency, the underlying mechanism remains identical. The addict uses the mood-altering experience to temporarily escape the devastating pain of their ruptured identity. Yet, the life-damaging consequences of the addictive ritual inevitably generate a new, profound wave of meta-shame, which cascades back into the original wound, reinforcing the belief of worthlessness and accelerating the destructive cycle. This self-generating spiral transforms the individual into a mechanism of pure compulsion, stripping away the ability to be present in one's own existence. The demonic reach of toxic shame extends far beyond personal addiction. It is the silent architect of criminality, violence, and the darkest manifestations of human cruelty. Individuals who have been emotionally, physically, or sexually annihilated often undergo a horrific psychological transformation, identifying with their aggressor in a desperate bid to reclaim a sense of power. The unbearable humiliation of victimization is acted out upon new victims, transforming the original trauma into a legacy of suffering. In every act of boundless grandiosity, in every expression of unrelenting judgment, and in every display of paranoid hypervigilance, we are witnessing the disabled human will thrashing wildly in the grip of internalized shame. It is an ultimate state of spiritual bankruptcy, a profound dehumanization where the inner life is entirely consumed by the frantic necessity of covering up a fundamentally fractured soul. Chapter 2. Roots and Shadows. The inheritance of identity does not occur in a vacuum. It is forged within the foundational architecture of the household. The family is the primary crucible where a child first encounters the concepts of worth, safety, and belonging. When this system operates with grace, it provides a mirror in which the child sees a reflection of their own innate value. However, when the family structure is fractured by unacknowledged pain and generational trauma, it becomes an incubator for toxic shame. Within these troubled environments, unspoken laws govern every interaction. The most suffocating of these is the covenant of silence, a rigid decree that demands the suppression of truth. Secrets, whether they involve addiction, abuse, or profound emotional neglect, are buried alive, and the family colludes in a shared delusion that everything is perfectly normal. For a child, this disconnect between what they intuitively feel and what they are commanded to believe is psychologically shattering. They learn to distrust their own senses, abandoning their inner reality to survive in an environment built on denial. In these shadowed systems, the demand for perfection acts as a merciless tyrant. Children are not loved for who they are, but for what they can achieve or how closely they can conform to an impossible ideal. Mistakes are not treated as natural milestones of human development, but as damning evidence of character flaws. When the illusion of absolute control is the family's primary defense against the chaos of life, any display of vulnerability, sadness, or fear is swiftly invalidated or punished. The child internalizes a devastating equation. To be human is to be unacceptable. They learn that their authentic emotions are dangerous, and in order to maintain a connection with their caregivers, they must surgically remove the parts of themselves that cause friction. This amputation of the authentic self leaves behind a hollow core, swiftly filled by the agonizing conviction that they are fundamentally defective. This contagion of shame does not remain confined within the walls of the childhood home. It is actively reinforced by the broader cultural structures designed to shape human behavior. Educational institutions, originally conceived as sanctuaries for intellectual exploration, often function as mechanisms of conformity. When systems prioritize rigid obedience and standardized achievement over natural curiosity, they inadvertently shame the unique developmental rhythms of the individual. The fear of public humiliation, the stigma of falling behind, and the relentless pressure to perform transform the joy of learning into a desperate struggle for validation. Furthermore, when rigid dogmas infiltrate the spiritual realm, the damage becomes existential. Belief systems that emphasize original unworthiness and eternal damnation wield the concept of God as an instrument of terror. Instead of offering a pathway to grace and connection, these structures weaponize human frailty, convincing the individual that their very existence is an offense to the divine. When spirituality is poisoned by toxic shame, the soul is left with nowhere to seek refuge. Because the agony of this internalized defectiveness is too immense to bear in daily life, the human psyche engages in a desperate act of survival. It builds fortresses. Toxic shame is a shapeshifter, surviving by disguising itself behind elaborate psychological defenses. The authentic self, trembling and convinced of its own unlovability, retreats into absolute darkness, while a manufactured false self is deployed to navigate the world. One of the most common and celebrated hiding places for this shame is the pursuit of absolute perfection. The perfectionist is not driven by a joyful pursuit of excellence, but by a frantic, exhausting flight from the fear of being exposed as a fraud. They construct an armor of flawless achievements, hoping that if they can just become entirely immune to criticism, the gnawing ache of worthlessness will finally subside. Yet, because the target is an illusion of godhood, the effort is doomed to fail, endlessly generating fresh waves of the very shame they are trying to escape. For others, toxic shame hides behind the iron shield of power and control. If a person feels entirely helpless and victimized in their core, they may overcompensate by dominating every environment and relationship they enter. By manipulating and controlling others, they ensure that no one can ever get close enough to witness their internal devastation. This desperation for control frequently manifests as sudden, explosive rage. Rage serves as a brilliant, albeit destructive, defense mechanism. It creates an immediate, intimidating boundary that pushes the world away, preemptively rejecting others before the self can be rejected. Behind every display of towering arrogance and relentless criticism of others lies an individual desperately projecting their own self-loathing outward. By keeping the spotlight fiercely focused on the flaws and failures of everyone around them, they temporarily distract themselves from the agonizing scrutiny of their own inner judge. Conversely, some surrender completely, hiding their toxic shame by abandoning their own identities to merge with another. This is the tragic architecture of codependency and compulsive people-pleasing. Believing they have no intrinsic value, the individual attempts to extract worth by becoming utterly indispensable to someone else. They become emotional chameleons, anticipating needs and absorbing the pain of others, mistaking this desperate entanglement for genuine love. They apologize for their own existence, accepting mistreatment because it aligns with their internal belief that they deserve nothing better. Whether the false self takes the form of the dominating tyrant, the untouchable perfectionist, or the self-sacrificing martyr, the underlying tragedy remains identical. The individual is trapped in an elaborate performance, forever exhausted, and completely isolated from the profound intimacy and connection that can only be experienced when the true self is brought into the light. Chapter 3. Breaking the Silence. Imagine a deep, ultra-minimal darkness, a cavern where the only illumination comes from a flickering fire casting distorted, high-contrast shadows against a cold stone wall. This is the ancient parable of the chained prisoners, a metaphor that perfectly mirrors the isolated existence of the toxically shamed. Bound since early life by invisible chains of unworthiness, the individual sits in absolute darkness, mistaking the twisted, looming shadows of their false self for reality. The darkness is absolute, yet it feels safe because it is known. To step out of this cinematic void requires confronting a blinding, terrifying light, the light of truth. Healing cannot begin in the shadows. The very nature of this psychological disease is concealment, and therefore, the only cure is radical exposure. The journey of recovery is fundamentally a process of externalization. It is the agonizing, necessary work of taking the secrets buried in the deepest black recesses of the soul and dragging them out into the illuminating light of shared human experience. For the individual paralyzed by internalized defectiveness, the idea of stepping out of isolation is inherently terrifying. The false self was meticulously constructed to ensure that no one would ever see the bleeding wounds beneath the armor. The ultimate lie whispered by toxic shame is that you are terminally unique in your brokenness, that if anyone truly saw the depths of your inadequacy, you would be utterly destroyed and immediately abandoned. Consequently, the shamed person clings to a defiant, exhausting self-reliance. They attempt to heal themselves in a vacuum, retreating further into their own minds, making silent resolutions, and fighting an invisible war entirely in isolation. But this solitary struggle is a fatal trap. A mind infected by shame cannot be the surgeon of its own healing. The isolation itself is the very oxygen that keeps the demonic force of shame alive, burning and expanding its territory within the psyche. Breaking this silence demands an act of unimaginable courage, the willing suspension of the false self. It begins with the throat-tightening decision to speak the unspeakable to another human being. This is not a casual confession. It is the deliberate shattering of the covenant of silence that has governed a lifetime. It requires finding a sanctuary, a non-shaming environment where the truth can finally be laid bare without the immediate threat of judgment or betrayal. This is why therapeutic communities, support groups, and circles of unconditional acceptance hold such transformative power. In these spaces, individuals do not gather to present their flawless achievements or project an image of invulnerability. They gather to mutually confess their absolute limitations. When a person finally voices their deepest, darkest secret and looks up to see not a face of disgust, but a face of profound recognition and empathy, the spell of toxic shame is instantly and irreversibly broken. The externalization process works through the miracle of the empathetic mirror. For decades, the shamed individual has stared exclusively into the distorted reflection of their own self-contempt. When they finally step out of hiding and share their authentic pain, the listening other becomes a new, unblemished mirror. Hearing another person say that they understand, that they have been there too, and that you are not alone, acts as a spiritual solvent. It dissolves the hardened, impenetrable shell of isolation. The paralyzing belief of terminal uniqueness shatters into 1,000 pieces. In this shared vulnerability, the individual discovers a revolutionary truth. The very wounds they believed disqualified them from human connection are, in fact, the universal bridge to it. The pain, once a source of absolute alienation, transforms into the common sacred ground of human solidarity. This emergence from the dark cave is not a singular triumphant event. It is an ongoing, daily practice. The instinct to retreat into the comfortable, familiar shadows of isolation will constantly flare up, especially when new, deeper layers of vulnerability are reached. The false self will fight for its survival, begging to return to the safety of silence. Yet every time the individual chooses exposure over concealment, they reclaim a fragment of their shattered will. By consistently verbalizing the feelings of inadequacy, the shame is externalized, stripped of its demonic, overwhelming power, and reduced to its natural, manageable size. The individual slowly learns the most profound lesson of recovery. They do not need to be perfect to be loved. They only need to be present, authentic, and brave enough to exist fully in the light. Chapter 4. The Framework for Transformation. The journey out of the dark cave of isolation cannot rely on sheer willpower. For the individual suffocating under the weight of internalized defectiveness, willpower is not the solution. It is part of the disease. The toxically shamed mind has spent a lifetime using its will to construct elaborate defenses, to suppress authentic emotion, and to violently force the self into impossible molds of perfection. To ask a fractured ego to heal itself through pure determination is akin to asking a drowning person to pull themselves up by their own hair. The false self is too deeply entrenched, too desperately vigilant to orchestrate its own dismantling. What is required instead is an architecture of surrender. This framework is not a sudden, magical awakening, but a rigorous, sequential dismantling of the illusions that have kept the soul in bondage. It is a systematic process of transmuting the poison of toxic shame back into the life-affirming boundaries of healthy humility. The foundational movement of this transformation is the profound, counterintuitive admission of absolute defeat. In a culture that fiercely idolizes control and relentless self-reliance, admitting powerlessness feels like a death sentence. Yet for the shame-bound individual, it is the only gateway to salvation. It is the moment the exhausted fighter finally drops their hands and admits that their life has become entirely unmanageable. They must brutally acknowledge that every attempt to outrun the gnawing ache of worthlessness, whether through the frantic pursuit of achievement, the numbing fog of addiction, or the suffocating grip of codependent control, has only deepened the despair. This surrender is not a collapse into victimhood. It is a profound collision with reality. It is the terrifying, liberating realization that the war against the authentic self is over and the false self has decisively lost. Once the illusion of omnipotent control is shattered, a terrifying void opens up. If the individual can no longer rely on their own fractured will to survive, they must look outward. They must come to believe that a restorative force, greater than their own isolated ego, can restore them to sanity. This force does not require adherence to a rigid, dogmatic deity. It can simply be the collective strength of a compassionate community, the undeniable truth of shared human experience, or the quiet, persistent wisdom of the universe itself. The critical leap is the willingness to entrust one's will and life to the care of this greater reality. It is a conscious decision to stop playing the solitary architect of the universe and to allow oneself for the first time to be guided, held, and supported by a structure larger than one's own pain. With a newfound anchor in reality, the individual must then turn their gaze inward, shining a high-contrast, unrelenting light into the shadowed corners of their past. This requires the undertaking of a fearless and searching moral inventory. This is not an exercise in self-flagellation, nor is it an opportunity for the inner critic to launch a new assault. It is the practice of objective witnessing. The individual meticulously documents the resentments that have poisoned their blood, the hidden fears that have dictated their choices, and the exact nature of the wrongs they have both suffered and inflicted. By writing these truths down, the shame is pulled from the chaotic, swirling vortex of the unconscious mind and pinned to the page. It is demystified. When these long-buried secrets are subsequently spoken aloud to another trusted human being, the demonic, isolating power of the shame evaporates, leaving behind only the manageable reality of human imperfection. As the inventory lays bare the intricate network of character defects, a profound shift in perspective occurs. The individual recognizes that their arrogance, their manipulative control, their paralyzing procrastination, and their explosive anger were not evidence of inherent evil, but desperate survival mechanisms. They were the armor the inner child wore to survive a war zone. Recognizing this, the individual becomes entirely ready to have these defensive shells removed. This readiness is a state of profound humility, a gentle, persistent request to be stripped of the obsolete armor that is now crushing the life out of them. It is the willingness to stand naked and vulnerable in the truth of one's own limitations, trusting that the authentic self, though fragile, is ultimately enough. The framework culminates in the courageous act of clearing the wreckage of the past. The shame-bound individual makes a list of all the people they have harmed while operating from within the frantic delusion of the false self, and they become willing to make direct amends. This is not a groveling apology born of guilt. It is a sovereign act of taking absolute responsibility for one's impact on the world. By repairing the damage done to others, the individual simultaneously repairs the fracture within their own soul. Finally, to ensure the false self does not silently rebuild its fortress, this framework becomes a daily discipline. Through continuous self-examination, meditation, and a commitment to carrying this message of healing to others still suffering in the dark, the individual maintains their hard-won spiritual awakening. The toxic shame is irreversibly metabolized, transformed into the very empathy and wisdom needed to navigate a truly authentic life. Chapter 5. Rescuing the Wounded. Inner Child. Time within the human psyche does not flow in a straight, continuous line. While the physical body ages, adapts, and moves inevitably forward, severe emotional trauma possesses the terrifying ability to freeze time completely. Deep within the architecture of the adult who suffers from toxic shame, there exists a literal psychological entity, the wounded inner child. This child is not a poetic metaphor or an abstract concept. It is a neurological and emotional reality. When early environments demand the suppression of authentic emotion for the sake of survival, the development of the self halts. That silenced, terrified child is pushed into the deep, dark, cinematic background of the unconscious mind, where they remain trapped, forever looping the exact moments of their profound abandonment and humiliation. Every instance of explosive adult rage, every paralyzing wave of anxiety, and every desperate cycle of addiction is simply this isolated child crying out from the shadows, desperately trying to get their unmet needs fulfilled through an adult body. To achieve genuine liberation, one cannot simply think their way out of toxic shame using adult rational logic. The adult mind, with all its sophisticated defenses, was constructed directly on top of this fractured foundation. Healing requires a deliberate, courageous descent back into the darkness of the past. The individual must undertake a rescue mission because the original caregivers were unable to provide the necessary sanctuary of unconditional love and mirroring. The individual must now cultivate the strength to become the champion, the protector, and the loving parent that their inner child never had. This is a profound act of psychological retrieval, stepping into the void to reclaim the parts of the self that were left behind in terror. The threshold to this retrieval is the heavy, agonizing process of original pain work, which fundamentally begins with grief. Modern culture frequently demands that we swiftly forgive, forget, and simply let go of the past. But it is a psychological impossibility to let go of a wound that has never been fully acknowledged. The adult must validate the child's horrifying reality. This requires mourning the childhood that was rightfully deserved but tragically denied. The lost innocence, the absent protection, the words that were violently silenced, all of it must be grieved with profound, unrestricted sorrow. The individual must allow themselves to feel the sheer outrage of having been violated or neglected. It is in this dark, heavy emotional space, when the defenses are finally lowered and the truth is faced without flinching, that the frozen tears of the past finally begin to thaw, releasing the bound-up energy that has kept the shame alive. As the grief is processed and the emotional paralysis fades, the deepest, most transformative work begins, confronting and re-scripting the specific toxic shame scenes. These are the haunting, high-contrast memories that play on a relentless loop in the mind, the moment of intense public humiliation by an authority figure, the terrifying unpredictability of a caregiver's rage, or the silent, crushing withdrawal of affection. These memories act as the core operating system for toxic shame. In the quiet theater of the mind, the adult self must now consciously step back into those memories, Using the power of focused visualization, the adult walks into the frame of that old, terrifying scene. With absolute authority and unshakable boundaries, the adult self steps between the vulnerable inner child and the original aggressor, halting the abuse and verbally defending the child. The adult then turns to the trembling child and speaks the words that should have been spoken decades ago. "You are not to blame for this. You are entirely innocent. I am here now. I will protect you, and I will never leave you." By consciously rewriting the emotional conclusion of these traumatic memories, the individual actively rewires their psychological circuitry. The paralyzing grip of toxic shame is unbound from the memory. The past cannot be erased, but its emotional tyranny can be permanently dismantled. The rescued child, finally feeling seen, validated, and safe, is then embraced and integrated into the present moment. No longer banished to the shadows of the unconscious, this reclaimed child brings with them their inherent buried gifts, boundless wonder, spontaneous creativity, and a pure, uncorrupted capacity for joy. Chapter 6. Integrating your disowned parts. The human personality is not born fractured. It is born as a unified, radiant whole, possessing the full, uninhibited spectrum of emotional capacity. But when a child is raised in an environment saturated with toxic shame, this innate wholeness becomes a profound liability. To secure love, to maintain connection, or simply to survive the turbulent waters of a dysfunctional household, the child must rapidly learn which aspects of their being are acceptable and which are condemned. If natural anger is met with violent punishment, the child instinctively amputates their own aggression. If sadness is mocked or vulnerability is exploited, they surgically sever their capacity for grief. This process is a desperate psychological butchery. The acceptable, compliant traits are pushed into the light to form the rigid, protective armor of the false self, while the condemned, unacceptable traits are banished into the absolute darkness of the unconscious mind. This exiled territory, this deep internal abyss, is what is known as the shadow. The shadow is not inherently evil, though the toxically shamed mind perceives it as a demonic force to be feared. It is simply the repository of everything the individual was forced to reject in order to survive. It certainly contains unexpressed rage, unwept tears, and forbidden appetites, but tragically, it also holds immense reserves of raw creativity, spontaneous joy, natural intuition, and untamed power. Because these disowned parts are locked away, they do not simply vanish. They fester and intensify in the dark. They become autonomous, operating entirely outside of conscious control, driven by a desperate, starving hunger to be recognized and felt. The shame-bound individual subsequently spends massive, exhausting amounts of psychological energy keeping the vault tightly closed, living in a constant low-grade terror that the shadow will one day break free, overwhelm the system, and destroy the meticulously crafted illusion of the false self. Because these exiled fragments of the soul cannot be safely acknowledged internally, they inevitably find expression externally through the powerful psychological mechanism of projection. The external world acts as a massive, high-contrast mirror for the subconscious. Whatever we have violently disowned within ourselves, we instinctively project onto the people around us. If an individual has repressed their own capacity for selfishness, they will be consumed by a harsh, unrelenting judgment of the selfishness they perceive in others. If they have disowned their own vulnerability, they will feel a visceral, irrational disgust when confronted with weakness or neediness in someone else. Conversely, we also project our disowned positive traits. We idolize romantic partners or charismatic leaders, placing them on impossible pedestals, completely unaware that the brilliance, strength, or beauty we worship in them is actually our own suppressed potential reflecting back at us. To map the unseen contours of one's own shadow, one must simply examine what triggers their most intense, disproportionate reactions, both hatred and infatuation, in the external world. True psychological liberation requires the total and permanent abandonment of the pursuit of perfection. Perfection is a sterile, unnatural, and ultimately lethal ideal that demands the continuous amputation of the self. The true goal of healing is not perfection, but wholeness. Wholeness demands that we walk directly into the shadowed, cinematic vault of the unconscious and actively reclaim every exiled fragment. We must invite the disowned, terrifying parts of ourselves back to the table of consciousness. This means deliberately sitting with our suppressed rage, acknowledging our deepest, most shameful jealousies, and holding space for our profound, hidden frailties, all without immediate condemnation. It is a radical act of internal hospitality. We must learn to look at the darkest aspects of our nature and say, I am that too. As the individual begins to name and claim these lost aspects, a profound alchemical shift occurs. The immense energy that was previously exhausted on maintaining the suppression is suddenly liberated, flooding the nervous system with new vitality. The integration of the shadow does not make a person monstrous or out of control. Paradoxically, it makes them safe, grounded, and entirely authentic. Anger, when reclaimed from the dark and integrated into conscious awareness, transforms into the healthy, fierce assertiveness necessary to set immovable boundaries. Paralyzing vulnerability, when embraced, transforms into the profound capacity for true intimacy. By embracing the absolute, unedited totality of who they are, the light and the dark, the saint and the sinner, the individual ceases to be a fractured collection of defensive walls. The exhausting, invisible civil war finally ends, replaced by a deep, resonant, and unshakable inner peace. Chapter 7. Silencing the Inner Critic. The human mind, when intact and healthy, is designed to be an internal sanctuary, a quiet expanse where the self can retreat, reflect, and gather strength. However, when the psyche has been profoundly contaminated by toxic shame, this sanctuary is violently overthrown. It transforms into an inescapable cinematic theater of internal warfare, and at the center of this desolation operates an unrelenting, merciless dictator, the toxic inner critic. This voice is the ultimate enforcer of the shame-bound identity. It does not sleep, it does not negotiate, and it demands absolute perfection, while simultaneously assuring the individual that such perfection is fundamentally impossible. Every action is scrutinized, every flaw is magnified into a catastrophic failure, and every success is immediately dismissed as a temporary, fraudulent illusion. To live under the tyranny of this inner judge is to endure a waking nightmare, chained to a prosecutor who occupies the very center of your own consciousness. It is a critical, life-saving psychological revelation to understand that this voice was not born with you. The toxic inner critic is not a natural component of the human soul. It is a hostile, external invader. In the vulnerable, highly impressionable years of early development, a child possesses no internal filter to evaluate the fairness of their environment. When they are subjected to relentless criticism, towering rage, or even the devastating, high-contrast silence of parental disappointment, the child does not simply hear these judgments, they swallow them whole. Through the psychological mechanism of introjection, the hostile voices of the outside world are internalized and mistakenly integrated into the core identity. The condemning gaze of a punishing father, the impossible standards of a rigid mother, or the cruelty of a shaming culture coalesce to form a continuous dark loop of audio in the mind. The most terrifying victory of this inner critic is its ability to disguise itself. The individual ceases to say that they were treated as worthless and instead begins to whisper in the dark, "I am worthless." This internalized dialogue operates as a closed, self-sustaining system of despair. When an individual attempts to break free from their toxic shame, attempting to step into the light of authentic connection or creative expression, the inner critic immediately escalates its attack. It floods the nervous system with paralyzing warnings of exposure, humiliation, and inevitable ruin. It utilizes the deeply buried memories of past pain as ammunition, ensuring the individual retreats back into the safety of isolation and the familiar, heavy armor of the false self. Because the voice feels so intimately connected to the self, fighting it directly with logic is often futile. You cannot simply argue with a phantom that knows every hidden insecurity and controls the levers of your own anxiety. The dismantling of this toxic inner regime demands a radical, courageous act of psychological separation. The individual must undergo the painstaking process of externalizing the voice, dragging it from the shadowy recesses of the unconscious and forcing it into the harsh, illuminating light of objective reality. This begins with the discipline of intense self-monitoring. The moment the wave of self-loathing hits, the individual must stop, detach, and aggressively interrogate the dialogue. They must write down the exact words the critic is speaking. By putting the internal abuse onto a physical page, the illusion of its absolute authority begins to fracture. The individual can then ask the crucial question of origin as they trace the cruelty back, recognizing the specific cadence of an abusive teacher or the exact phrasing of a dismissive caregiver. The demonic power of the voice collapses. It is unmasked not as the voice of truth, but as a damaged, obsolete recording from a tragic past. Once the critic is identified as a foreign entity, the adult self must fiercely rise to defend the internal landscape. It is not enough to simply ignore the toxic voice. It must be actively replaced through the deliberate, conscious practice of self-reparenting. A new internal dialogue must be engineered from the ground up. When the critic screams of absolute failure, the awakened adult must consciously, forcefully respond with the immovable truth of human limitation and non-negotiable worth. This is not a superficial exercise in positive thinking. It is a rigorous daily battle for the reclamation of the mind. It requires the continuous cultivation of an inner champion, a voice of profound, unconditional compassion and unyielding boundaries. Over time, through relentless repetition and the sheer force of conscious will, the neural pathways of self-hatred begin to wither. The toxic critic is slowly starved of its power, its volume reduced to a faint, powerless whisper, until the mind is finally restored to its rightful state as a sanctuary of peace. Chapter 8. The Architecture of Self-Forgiveness. To navigate the heavy, shadowed terrain of the human experience without accumulating mistakes is an absolute impossibility. Yet, for the individual bound by toxic shame, a single error is never interpreted as a natural misstep. It is viewed as catastrophic proof of their inherent defectiveness. There is a profound architectural difference between guilt and shame. Healthy guilt whispers, "I have done something wrong," allowing for correction, restitution, and a return to equilibrium. Toxic shame, however, screams into the deep black void of the psyche, "I am wrong." It is an identity crisis masquerading as a moral failing. When we operate from this toxic core, self-forgiveness feels not only impossible but dangerous. We mistakenly believe that our relentless self-punishment is the only force keeping our fundamentally flawed nature in check, completely unaware that the punishment itself is the very engine driving our continued suffering. Breaking this relentless loop requires an act of radical rebellion against our own internalized conditioning. It demands the conscious, deliberate choice to love oneself. In the realm of recovery, love is not a soft, passive emotion. It is an active, fierce, and immovable decision. It is the conscious refusal to continue abandoning oneself in the face of failure. To construct this architecture of self-forgiveness, we must first abandon the cinematic illusion of perfection. Perfectionism is a sterile, inhuman landscape, entirely devoid of the high-contrast lighting of genuine human growth. When we demand absolute flawlessness from ourselves, we are not striving for excellence. We are desperately building a fortress to protect us from the agonizing vulnerability of being seen as human. Forgiving oneself requires a profound shift in perspective, moving from the role of the merciless judge to that of a compassionate witness. When an old memory of a humiliating mistake surfaces, threatening to pull the mind back into the abyss of self-loathing, the awakened individual must consciously intervene. Instead of recoiling from the memory, we must look directly at the past version of ourselves who committed the error. We must recognize that they were operating with limited tools, obscured vision, and often an overwhelming burden of unhealed trauma. They were doing the absolute best they could to survive in the dark. Extending forgiveness to that past self does not erase the consequence of the action, but it permanently severs the emotional chain that binds our present identity to our historical failures. This conscious act of self-love must become a daily, rigorous practice. It is the steady, quiet work of replacing the heavy armor of the false self with the resilient strength of authenticity. When we make the conscious choice to forgive ourselves for our inevitable human clumsiness, we finally step out of the shadows. We reclaim our right to belong to the human race, not as untouchable, perfect deities, but as beautiful, flawed, and infinitely capable beings. The agonizing terror of exposure evaporates, leaving behind a profound, grounded peace. We learn that our mistakes are not the end of our story. They are the exact necessary friction required to polish the soul, allowing our true self to finally stand clearly in the light. Chapter 9. Healing the relational mirror, to step into the arena of human intimacy, is to step in front of the ultimate psychological mirror. Relationships do not simply add to our lives, they magnify and reflect the deepest, most hidden structures of our own self-worth. For the individual carrying the heavy, agonizing burden of toxic shame, this mirror is a source of absolute terror. When the core belief is one of inherent defectiveness and unlovability, genuine connection becomes a psychological impossibility. Intimacy, at its very root, requires the courageous act of allowing another person to see into the depths of who we truly are. But if the authentic self has been banished to the dark, cinematic background of the unconscious, and only a meticulously constructed false self is presented to the world, what is the partner actually connecting with? They are interacting with a phantom, a defensive shell designed specifically to keep them at a safe, impenetrable distance. Because the shame-bound individual feels entirely empty and devoid of internal value, they frequently approach relationships not as a union of two whole beings, but as a desperate rescue mission. They seek a romantic savior, someone whose love, approval, and constant presence will finally fill the agonizing void within. This desperate hunger creates the architecture of enmeshment and codependency. In a codependent bond, the boundaries between two people dissolve entirely. They do not operate as separate individuals with their own distinct thoughts, feelings, and limits. They fuse together in a suffocating attempt to complete one another. The toxically shamed partner will often abandon their own needs, suppress their own voice, and endure profound mistreatment, all driven by the terrifying conviction that they cannot survive the abandonment of this external source of worth. It is an exhausting performance, a high-contrast dance of control and compliance, where neither person is truly known and neither person is truly free. Furthermore, the unconscious mind possesses a haunting, almost magnetic compulsion to resolve the original pain of childhood. We do not choose our partners by accident. An individual bound by toxic shame will instinctively, flawlessly seek out a partner who perfectly mirrors the emotional dynamics of their earliest, most traumatic caregivers. If a person grew up navigating the volatile rage of a parent, they will often find themselves inexplicably drawn to a partner with a similar explosive darkness. They do this not because they enjoy the suffering, but because the unconscious mind is desperately trying to rewrite history. It believes that if it can just manage to win the love and approval of this new, yet familiar abuser, the original wound will finally be healed. This creates a relentless, agonizing cycle of conflict where both partners continually trigger each other's deepest insecurities, violently projecting their disowned shadows onto the person they claim to love. To heal the relational mirror, the entire foundation of how we approach connection must be dismantled and rebuilt. The absolute prerequisite for a healthy relationship is not finding the right partner, but becoming a whole, differentiated individual. Healing requires the painful, necessary work of withdrawing our projections and taking absolute responsibility for our own emotional survival. We must stop demanding that our partners act as our therapists, our saviors, or the perfect, unconditional parents we never had. When we finally recognize that the aching void inside cannot be filled from the outside, the desperate, suffocating grip of codependency is broken. We step back, reclaim our own center of gravity, and begin the rigorous practice of defining and defending our own boundaries. True intimacy is born in the quiet, terrifying space of vulnerability. It is the moment the false self is consciously lowered and the hidden, flawed, authentic self is brought into the light. This requires immense courage, for there is no guarantee that the vulnerability will not be met with rejection. Yet it is the only pathway to genuine love. When we communicate our true needs without manipulation, when we admit our fears without retreating into defensive anger, and when we allow ourselves to be seen in our absolute human imperfection, we transform the relational mirror. If the partner is capable of meeting this vulnerability with empathy and respect, the relationship ceases to be a battlefield of overlapping traumas. It becomes a sacred sanctuary, a shared quiet space where two separate whole individuals choose to walk alongside each other, illuminating the darkness and affirming the profound beauty of their shared humanity. Chapter 10. The Spiritual Awakening. The culmination of the journey out of the dark cave of toxic shame is not merely psychological stability, it is a profound and revolutionary spiritual awakening. For the majority of human history, spirituality has often been tragically misunderstood and weaponized. The toxically shamed mind frequently perceives the divine as an ultimate, terrifying judge, a cosmic extension of the flawed, punishing caregivers of childhood. This distorted theology demands the absolute suppression of the physical self, creating a violent, agonizing split between the body and the soul. The flesh, and particularly the profound energy of human sexuality, is condemned as inherently sinful, while the spirit is elevated as an unreachable ideal. This manufactured war within the self is the ultimate victory of toxic shame, rendering true spiritual connection impossible by demanding the amputation of our fundamental human nature. True spiritual awakening requires the radical healing of this deeply ingrained split. It is the realization that we are not pure, unblemished spirits trapped in an inherently corrupted physical vessel. We are unified, whole beings where the physical and the spiritual are inextricably intertwined. To embrace healthy shame is to embrace the absolute, unedited reality of our human form, complete with its natural limitations, its biological drives, and its profound vulnerabilities. When sexuality is uncoupled from the crushing weight of internalized defectiveness, it ceases to be a source of hidden terror or compulsive acting out. It is reclaimed as a sacred, life-affirming expression of ultimate intimacy. By fully inhabiting our bodies and honoring our physical boundaries, we do not distance ourselves from the divine. Rather, we create the essential, grounded foundation necessary to truly experience it. As the fractured pieces of the self are integrated and the relentless noise of the toxic inner critic is finally silenced, a vast, quiet space opens up within the psyche. It is in this profound stillness that an individual begins to discover their true spiritual destiny. Toxic shame violently interrupts this destiny by forcing the individual to live an inauthentic life, perpetually exhausting their energy on the construction and maintenance of the false self. But when the heavy armor of perfectionism and control is permanently discarded, the authentic self emerges, bringing with it a unique, undeniable calling. This destiny is not necessarily a grand, external achievement designed for public applause. It is the quiet, immovable certainty of one's own intrinsic value and the unique configuration of gifts, passions, and eccentricities that only they possess. To step into this destiny is to finally occupy the exact space in the universe that was always meant for you. The ultimate paradox of this healing journey is that the very emotion that once served as the source of our greatest agony, shame, is transformed into the ultimate guardian of our spirituality. When metabolized from its toxic, demonic state back into its natural, healthy form, shame becomes the vital anchor of our humanity. It provides the essential blessing of humility. Healthy shame acts as a gentle internal boundary, reminding us that we are not God. We are wonderfully, perfectly finite. This acceptance of our limitation instantly relieves us of the exhausting, impossible burden of trying to control the universe and everyone within it. It grants us the profound permission to be exactly who we are, without the desperate need for artificial inflation or the agonizing terror of deflation. From this grounded state of humility arises the ultimate spiritual blessing, a profound transformative sense of awe. When we are no longer consumed by the frantic defense of our own fragile egos, we are finally able to look outward and perceive the staggering immensity and mystery of existence. We recognize that we are part of a vast, interconnected tapestry of life, intricately woven into the lives of others and the silent, unfolding reality of the cosmos. The deep, dark isolation of toxic shame is permanently shattered, replaced by an unshakable sense of belonging. The individual realizes they are not a defective mistake abandoned in the void, but a necessary, luminous thread in the fabric of the universe. The journey is complete not when we transcend our humanity, but when we finally, unconditionally surrender to it, discovering that the light we sought was waiting for us all along, hidden precisely within our deepest vulnerabilities.